What's going on, everybody? I am here to do a review for the Janet Jackson documentary part 1 that aired on Lifetime and A&E on January 28, 2022. This is actually like I said, a two-parter. They've aired the first two hours tonight on Friday. Of course, by the time you see this video, it'll be Saturday, and then the second part you'll get from me on Sunday. And let me just tell you that so far, this has been a very great documentary from beginning to end. I learned so much new information about Janet Jackson, her upbringing, her life, leading all the way up until Control. Because the first part basically talks about her early life, when she was born in Gary, Indiana, and ending off of her Rhythm Nation tour in 1990. So we're covering basically from 1966 to 1990. And I made sure to take notes because I knew it would have been hard for me to try to remember all of this information. So I have them right here in front of me, and I'm gonna just go based off of that. And I may not be able to cover every single thing, but I do have most of the important stuff in here. So when the documentary actually starts, it talks about her early life, like I said before, her being born, and shout out to her being a Taurus. She's a Taurus like me. May 16th, 1966 is when she was born. She is the youngest and last and final child to Joseph and Catherine Jackson. She's the baby girl of the family. She's the third sister out of 9 children, growing up in Gary, Indiana, in that tiny small house. And it basically starts off with her and Randy going back to Gary and visiting that house that they were born and grew up in. Even though Janet didn't spend most of the time in that house because she was young, by the time she came up to a certain age, her and the family ended up moving to California because her brothers were already established and famous, and they just uprooted and just kind of left out of there. What I liked is that Randy, being the older brother, he actually showed her around the house, showed her some different things, and had to explain things to her because she wouldn't remember it because she was just a baby at the time. She was a little toddler, so she wouldn't remember much. So he had to kind of guide her and tell her things like, this is where we slept, this is where we ate, and this was here, this was there, and all different types of stuff like that. It was some things that she did kind of remember, but it wasn't much that she did remember in that aspect because she was a young child. She was a little girl, so they wouldn't expect her to memorize or remember as much. Then they started to talk about Joe Jackson a little bit, talk about how he, raised them, brought them up, and the family life, and how he had to do what he had to do. He used to work in a steel mill, but he was also a musician at the same time, and he just wanted the best for his family. This documentary, at least in this first part right here, has painted Joe Jackson in the best light that I think I've ever seen him be painted in, because the mainstream media always painted Joe Jackson as this monster. And it actually kind of dims down a little bit. It makes me kind of look at the Jackson American Dream movie that came out in the early 90s. It kind of gives me the side eye for me now of how they portray Joe Jackson in that movie as this extremely abusive father who was just trying, who was overly abusive when it came to his children and getting to where they needed to be. But Janet was just basically saying how growing up in that area of Gary, there was a lot of drugs and a lot of gang activity, and he just wanted to make sure that his family, especially his kids, did not get wrapped up into the streets and get lost into that life. So that's why he kept them pretty much grounded and wrapped up in music. That was the way that they were able to escape from that life that potentially could have came to them, but it did not, fortunately, and that's because of him. And, Joe Jackson, despite whatever they could say about Joe Jackson in the mainstream media, he was indeed one of the best fathers in the world for a multitude of reasons. And I'm glad that this documentary has painted him in a very good light. The next thing that they talked about was them moving to LA. Now the Jackson 5, they're megastars. So, we can't stay in Gary, Indiana anymore. So now we got to move to LA. And one interesting thing about them saying is they moved to LA is the neighborhood they moved to, they were like the only black family that lived on the block, where everyone else was a white family. And then Janet went into talking about how she experienced racism when she was living in that neighborhood. She said she got called the N-word. She would say that they told her to go back to her country. Of course, we know what they talking about when they say that. She even said when she was in school that the teachers and the students will touch her hair because, you know, our hair texture is different from theirs. She even said that some even came up and started to rub on her skin to see what black skin felt like. And, you know, that kind of reminds me of a story that my dad told me when he was working years ago about how this white woman from Pennsylvania probably grew up in a shelter life, mainly around a lot of white people, probably never came in contact with any black person ever. And then she said that he told me that she would have rubbed his skin one time to see if it was real or to see if the black on the skin would rub off or anything like that. And you know, they reminded me of my dad telling me that story. So she just, you know, dealt with a little, you know, with racism back then. And it's crazy because even though she was a Jackson and her brothers are who they were, that did not stop racism from coming their way. But then, of course, she was Janet, so she really wasn't known. It's not like she was her brothers, or more importantly, she wasn't Michael. So, but either way, it just shows that even if you were black back then and you still had a level of notoriety and even popularity, there was still a level of scrutiny that you had to deal with at the time because you were black in America, and that's just what it was. The next part that they talked about was, and forgive me if I'm jumping around a little bit, like I said, I'm just talking about like the different key things that I took away from this documentary. The next part they talk about is when they start performing in Vegas. That's of course when the Jacksons ended up getting their variety show. If you go online, you can see clips. And one thing I really liked about this documentary is that the amount of footage that we have never seen before that they put into this is just so refreshing to see. But she was talking about how they performed in Vegas. They had the variety show, and she said they were the only kids to have a show on the Las Vegas Strip because, you know, the Las Vegas Strip was more for adults. You had your magic shows. Of course, you had your nudity, the nudie bars or the strip clubs and everything like that. But they were the only ones that had a show on the Las Vegas Strips where it was kids performing, even though they were performing for adults. And Janet even said that, you know, why does it feel like they're clapping for us considering where we are and in Vegas? But she said it dawned on her that we're kids and we're cute. So people are going to eat that up. She said, I bet if we were adults performing like this, we probably would not get that much of a reception. But because we were kids and we were youthful, it sold, you know, to an audience that thought, oh, they're so cute, they're so adorable, so we're just going to go and we're going to run with that. The next part they're talking about was Janet's first acting gig away from the family, which of course is none other than her playing Penny on Good Times. Everybody knows about little Penny on Good Times. She ended on to Good Times in 1976. And that scene, of course, in the documentary, they ended up playing that scene where she gets burnt with the iron. Of course, we don't see her get burned with the iron. And that was one of the first times we saw Janet play a role where it was no laughing matter. It was nothing comedic about it, even though she was on a sitcom and playing a role of an abused little girl who ends up getting adopted by another woman who's never had kids. And she had to like literally become like a motherly figure, and she's never had to be that. But in that moment, she knew that she had to get this little girl away from this abusive parent. Of course, we know that person was Willona, played by Jade DeBarge, and R.I.P. to her. She passed away a few years ago. I have a feeling if she was still alive, Janet would have definitely had her in this documentary. But unfortunately, you know, things happen. And by the way, this is a documentary that Janet started 5 years ago. So what we're looking at in this documentary is from 5 years ago, probably leading up until now. So yeah, it's not like the documentary we're watching was from 2021. It started in 2017. And ironically, that's the year that she came to my job to do when she was on tour to do one of her concerts. And let me tell you, at the age of the 51, I believe at the time when she came, she still has it. She still has it. She probably can't maneuver as flexible as she used to, but she still has enough where she can give a good show. If you ever get a chance to see Janet in concert, you've never seen her, I would highly suggest that you do. The next part that they talk about is Janet's first album. A lot of people think Control was her first album. Control was more of her breakout album, but she actually had two albums before that. She had one that was her self-titled debut, just called Janet Jackson. She even said that when she had the album, she didn't even want Jackson on the album cover. She just wanted it to be Janet because she felt that if the name Jackson was on the album cover, that people would not pay attention to her. They will always be talking about Michael, because that just kind of lingered on. And I'm actually talk about that a little bit later on in this review. So she just didn't want that name, that Jackson name on the album, because she knew that people would like start comparing her to Michael and everything like that. She had her first album, then she released another album after it called Dream Street. Both of those albums did not sell well at all. And this was at a time when her father, Joe Jackson, was managing her career. Because by the time Janet started releasing her own music, the brothers had already parted ways from him. Like, they had separated from him and started doing their own thing. And Janet was the only one left behind. But they discovered Janet had a little bit of a talent when she was recording some songs just for fun, and left the recording piece on. And her dad and her brothers had heard it, and he said, "You're going to sing." Because Janet originally said she wanted to go to college for business, I think business law or business, something to do with business. I can't remember exactly what she said, but she said she wanted to go to college. But Joe Jackson was like, "No, you're going to sing. Like, we know that you have the talent to be able to sing, and that's exactly what you're going to do." And that's basically what happened. She did 2 albums, but those 2 albums didn't do well, and that was that. And she could have stopped after that if she wanted to, but she decided not to. And that leads into, I guess, the first controversy with Janet Jackson, and that is her marrying James DeBarge. As of course you know, James DeBarge, that name rings bells. Not just because his James, but the DeBarge family as a whole. And she ended up meeting him when she was like 16. They ended up getting married in a secret wedding when she turned 18 in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And then one thing she was saying about this marriage, or on the night that they got married, after they got married, they went back to the hotel, and then she said James had left and said he would be back, and she said that she didn't hear from him for about 2.5 hours, and that's when he came back. So it turns out the reason why she hadn't heard from him is because he was out somewhere doing drugs. Now, there is no secret that the DeBarge family has a serious history with heavy narcotic usage. This is no surprise or secret to anybody. Everyone knows that the DeBarge family had a huge drug issue throughout that entire family. It wasn't just a one-off with one family member. It was several family members. As a matter of fact, some of them died because of drug usage. And I always attribute it back to their dad. In case y'all didn't know, their dad was very extremely abusive. Like, he actually made the stories that they made about Joe Jackson seem amateurish, because, you know, they always painted Joe Jackson as this bad parent, this abusive parent. But no, the DeBarges, their dad was so abusive that I've even heard stories that he actually molested a couple of them. And, you know, that sticks with you for a while. And some people cope in different ways, and I guess their coping mechanism was drugs. And it's very unfortunate that it ended up happening. But yeah, when I heard that, when she said that he was out for like 2.5 hours just doing drugs, I just knew that that marriage was bound to fail. And that's exactly what happened, because they were only in that marriage for about a year before they actually got it annulled. And that actually brought on another rumor that Janet Jackson had a secret child with James DeBarge. And that was nothing more than just a rumor. They tried to say that her niece, who looks extremely like her, was her daughter. And then they said when they couldn't get anything on that, they started to shift it to another niece, and that's not her daughter. They even made rumors saying that the child was staying with Rebe, or one was staying with Tito. Like, they made up so many rumors. And even when she started working on Fame, because that was the next thing she started working on while she was going through it with James, she said, like, Debbie Allen was saying, she was with us every day. Where was the child? Like, and then Janet was saying she took birth control pills and everything like that. And she said back then the birth control pill would actually make you gain a little bit of weight. So a lot of people thought that maybe she was pregnant, but it turns out she wasn't pregnant. It's just that was the side effect of the pill. But she never had this secret child that they claimed that she had with James. And speaking of James, it even got worse in their marriage, because she was saying that one time he went out, and while he was gone or something like that, and I could have it a little bit wrong, but she said she tried to flush the drugs down the toilet, and they even got into a tussling thing when he kept trying to get the drugs away from her because he was on a binge. So, and that's when she knew that she had to get out of that marriage. And she said that I want a divorce, and because she said she had drove him over to his brother's house, and she said, I want a divorce. She said that he had got so mad, but he had got out of the car, and she said immediately after he closed that car door, she immediately locked the door because out of fear that he would probably come back in and probably, do some damage. So she, like, at that point, she said that she was completely done with that marriage and she had to, like, move forward. And then that's pretty much where the annulment between her and James came to play. And let me see. The next part is after separating from her husband, now it's another man in her life that she had to separate from, and that was her dad. She knew that, she loved her dad, great, dad to father her, good manager, but she knew that in order to go further with her career, she had to move forward without him. So when they got to that part, I knew exactly what this was leading into. So she said she had to get away from her dad. This was the best thing that she could do for her career. And it's a good move that she made. It's a good thing that she did it, because by her leaving from her dad, that now transcends into her third album, which many people thought was her first album, but it wasn't. But it was more of her breakout album. And that album, of course, was none other than Control. Control is probably one of the best albums ever released. Like, almost every song on that album is good. You can listen to that album without skipping a song from beginning to end. And not only did that album come up, but that's also when she ended up hooking up with Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis, who are probably one of the most iconic music producers ever. I mean, before you had Teddy Riley and all of them, you had Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis. And of course, Quincy Jones was before them. And that was one of the best things that could have happened for her career. And that album, Control, is still, like, to this day, one of the best albums ever. And of course, and they showed there in the clips, they showed, her meeting Paula Abdul, who was one of the main choreographers for the dance sequences on the songs that required them, which was quite a bit because she had a lot of upbeat songs for that album. And Paula Abdul pretty much was the choreographer for just about every upbeat song on that album. So Control came out and she, did phenomenal with that. So let me go ahead and get to the next one. I'm actually moving quite along with this review. Actually, I'm almost at the end. So after, with Control, she ends up, meeting someone else. She ends up meeting someone, another love of her life by the name of Rene Elizondo. Now, I have heard of him, and some of you have seen him before, or seen his hands. If y'all remember the Janet album, the Janet cover where she's standing and is a man's hands covering her breasts, those are his hands. He was in a couple of her videos. As a matter of fact, in the movie Poetic Justice, where you had Tupac and the actor who played Chicago, I can't think of his Guy Torry, when they were in the post office and you had that Hispanic sounding guy talking to them. That was her husband, because they did end up getting married. She was actually with him for quite some time because they met like in the late 80s. And then they ended up getting married, and they were together for a few years. They were together, of course, way longer than her and James DeBarge. And apparently, looking at it, that was a good pick for her, like a good matchup for her. Like, she said that was someone that she definitely needed. And she said that was like a breath of fresh air, considering what she was dealing with prior to that. So she's definitely, she's in love, and he definitely had a huge hand in helping her out when it came to her career and the creativity of her albums, and of course later on when it went to her tour. So he definitely was a good look for her at the time. The next part actually kind of annoyed me, not because because of the documentary itself, but I'm sure it annoyed her just as much as it annoyed me because it happened with her. Janet is coming off of the success of Control. Right now, she's at the height of popularity. Everybody knows who she is, but she cannot shake that Jackson name for nothing, because every time she's being interviewed or asked questions, Michael's name always came up. So, and it's like some people will see it, oh, maybe she's just jealous of him. No, it's not a jealousy thing. It's a fact of, you're talking to me. Why are you constantly and always bringing up my brother when he's not here? If you want to ask Michael questions, then you find a way to interview him. But right now you're talking to me. So I know that annoyed the hell out of her, because I'm looking at the clips when she's being asked questions and they kind of collage them and stack them with each other. And looking at that annoyed me. I'm like, you're here to talk to me. Why are you asking me about my brother? Because like, this has nothing to do with him. No offense to him. He's doing his own thing and, you know, being great. But you're talking to me right now. It even was a part in the documentary where she was, I guess like she was somewhere overseas and the fans was like running up and, you know, because the car window was down, and one of the fans, two of them actually came up and was like, Janet, how is Michael doing? How is Michael doing? And I'm like, you're running up to me, taking pictures of me and asking me about my brother, but not about me. So now I can see why Janet wanted to shake that name. It's not because she didn't want the name. It's because she knew what was coming with it. So that was the whole thing about, you know, about that. The next thing we're talking about is, of course, the release of her follow-up album to Control, which was Rhythm Nation 1814. And fun fact, in case y'all did not know, I never knew for years what the 1814 stood for until a couple of years back. The 18 and the 14 represents the 18th and 14th letter of the alphabet, R being the 18th letter, and N being the 14th letter. Rhythm Nation. So that's where the 1814 came from, because I always wanted to know for years, what did that 1814 stand for? But that's what it is. So she's talking about, you know, making the Rhythm Nation album, and it actually showed a clip in there where her and Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis recording like some of the tracks, and it even showed like a little riff or a little argument that they got into, which actually showed a side of Janet that we rarely ever see, and that's her actually get mad. Outside of when she went crazy in that Why Did I Get Married To album, but that was for a movie, so it wasn't like, you know, this wasn't a scripted thing right here when it came to her being upset about that. But it was just like a little argument that her and I think it was Jimmy that had with each other because of something so petty, but it is what it is. They said that Janet at times can get a little bit stubborn. Hey, she's a Taurus. That Taurus energy is something serious. You piss us off and we can hold it over your heads for a while. It just is what it is. But it just showed them, you know, and one thing I liked about that clip is that it's showing them create an album and how technical it is. It's not easy creating an album. You got to think how much work goes into making one song for an album, let alone making multiple songs for that album, and then having to select what songs is best for the album and which ones to shelve and possibly put on a future album. But they said that Janet wanted to make a lot of songs for the album. And if you notice a pattern or a theme with Janet's albums, she has a lot of tracks. Like her Janet album has so many tracks because of the interludes. I say she's the queen of interludes. She loves interludes in her albums, like little pieces that fall in between songs. And I'm sure they're going to talk about that hopefully when they get to that part in part 2 when they talk about the Janet album. And the last thing that they talk about is her first tour, because the Rhythm Nation tour was her very first tour. She didn't have a tour for Control. It kind of reminds me of Michael, because, you know, when Michael came out with Thriller, he didn't have a Thriller tour. He was still doing tours with his brothers when Thriller was still out, but he didn't have a tour by himself as far as for his album until Bad. It kind of reminds me with Janet that she didn't have a tour until the follow-up after a big album, which for her was Control. And she was saying how she had a dream the night before that when she went out on stage, only 3 people were in the crowd. Well, good thing she only had a dream, because when she went out in reality and was a wide awake, it was way more than 3 people. It was probably over 3,000. It was like a huge crowd of people, and it showed a clip of her performing Rhythm Nation. I still think that Rhythm Nation costume, that outfit is fire. I don't care what anybody says. That is a fire costume. And, you know, just her performing and everything like that and having success with that album. Good follow, a good sophomore album. And the documentary pretty much cuts right there, and then just shows a preview of what's to come in the second part, which is when we're really going to get into, I guess you can say, the juice and the meat of things. It's going to really dive deep into this, and I can't wait to see what that part is. But that's pretty much the first part of the Janet Jackson documentary. This is the first part. I will be back tomorrow to give the concluding part, which is part 2. Like I said, I'm recording this on Friday, January 28th. Of course, when y'all see it, it'll be January 29th. And tomorrow I'll be recording part 2, and that'll be up on Sunday. But y'all let me know what y'all think down in the comments. Like, share, subscribe if you have not done so already. Make sure you hit that notification bell to be notified every time I upload a new video or go live. And I will talk to you in the next one.